I just wanted to hop up here and continue with the program and introduce our next speaker while you all continue to enjoy your lunch. But it is my privilege to introduce someone that has been absolutely central to making all of this possible, Joshua Trevino. Josh serves as Senior Advisor to the President. He is Senior Director for our Western Hemisphere Initiative, and he is Senior Fellow for Europe here at the America First Policy Institute. He is also the Chief Transformation Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So he has a lot of jobs and he wears many hats. And as if that weren't enough, he is also a speechwriter and ghostwriter for a variety of high-level principles, both in government and in public life. And he has a lot of major speeches and even a New York Times bestseller to his credit. Josh previously served also as a speechwriter in the administration of President George Bush, and he was an officer in the United States Army. In his many roles, Josh has focused on the US-Mexico relationship, Western Hemisphere strategy, and America's ties to Europe. And he's always had a very clear understanding of our national interest and our national identity. Most of you in this room, I think, have met Josh already because he's been tirelessly working on these issues for a lot of years. And he's been working on them really before they even became widely recognized. And I've had the privilege of seeing that up close, working with Josh for about 4 years now. And I think I can confidently say that few people have done more to bring structure and clarity and urgency to this conversation and to the way that we think about the Western Hemisphere region in general. At TPPF, at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Josh was way ahead of the curve on the importance of the US-Mexico relationship, on the need to recognize the evolving nature of the Mexican state, and the need also for a more serious and assertive approach as far as the American security posture. And then during his time here at the America First Policy Institute, which began over a year ago now, he was also ahead of the curve on the need to designate cartels as foreign terror organizations, secure critical infrastructure such as the Panama Canal, and to treat the Western Hemisphere as a true strategic priority. So I'm not saying he's a prophet, but he continues to be ahead of the curve on everything. Josh, your leadership has been indispensable, not only to building this and building our Western Hemisphere initiative, but in bringing us to this moment. Thank you so much for being here. Help me in welcoming Josh to the stage.
There's only two people who I can rely upon to praise me regularly, and one is my mom, and the other is Melissa Ford. So you'll have to. I want to start by asking your forgiveness for something. I'm going to talk on the roots of American strategy in the Western Hemisphere, which is something that's important to understand. So there's going to be a little bit of a historical disquisition, and probably about 2/3 of the way, you're going to ask, where on earth is this going? But I want to promise you up front, it's all wrapping up in a nice bow at the end. Because the argument fundamentally that I want to make, and that I think happens to be empirically true, is that the United States acts in the Western Hemisphere according to a set of imperatives that were set down 4 centuries ago. In that vein, American strategy in the Western Hemisphere was foreordained. Before we get into why this is, I want to define exactly what we mean by Americans. We are in the Americas, to be sure, but there is only one widely recognized demonym that goes by American. Just one of the dozens of republics in our hemisphere comprehensively claim it, and it is this United States of America. So though we speak of the Americas and of Latin America, and the writings of Bolivar and his companions speak of the Americans as a class of Iberian-descended and mestizo peoples, America is fundamentally the nation founded in the first place by the English, who arrived on North America's Atlantic shores in 1607 and 1620, and then expanded across that continent to become the country that we have today. E pluribus unum goes the slogan, but the unum is defined first and foremost by the Virginia Cavaliers and the Massachusetts Puritans, the synthesis and conflict between whom has been the prime engine for the subsequent 4 centuries of American history and strategy. From this, we derive the motive forces in that American strategy. They're 4 at hand. None of them will be a surprise to any student of the topic, by which I mean strategy in general and not America. A strategy to a nation is like a philosophy to a person. You have one whether you wish it or not, and whether you realize it or not. Every nation is moved to its own strategy by four principal factors: by geography, by sentiment, by threat, and by circumstance. And I trust I'm not trespassing here upon the sublime thought of the eminent strategic thinkers in saying so. One of the perennial misapprehensions of American action in the world is the belief that it possesses a subtlety, a hidden plan, a Gnostic quality, a sort of Straussian direction perceptible only to the deeply discerning. That is rarely true. Across 2.5 centuries, the United States has only occasionally acted with quiet deliberation. It's not our way. That doesn't mean we have no directionality in our aims and purpose. Far from it. American strategy across the centuries contains within itself great purpose. What we see in the year 2026 is, properly understood, not a departure from the preceding 4 centuries, but continuous with it. Our interest in the Americas in this hemisphere has evolved with its own continuity. The Americans are, after all, our geographic home, even as Europe is our civilizational home and progenitor. We cannot forget that last part. As Americans, we cannot forget that all the cathedrals of Europe had infinitely more to do with the American inheritance than does the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. America is a nation of many peoples and many faiths, but its core, in its English origin and foundation, it is an expression first of Europe. That is key to understanding our strategy. To understand it now requires exploring its origins in our past. American independence is declared in 1776. We celebrate it this year, the 250, but it was not secured until 1783 when the Treaty of Paris affirmed both American battlefield endurance and British civic exhaustion. We were fortunate in the politics of Great Britain in that moment. The kingdom with the degeneration was to show its endurance unto victory against a foe vastly more potent than the United States. It's no disrespect to General George Washington to acknowledge that the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was a greater threat in every sphere. Yet that outcome, given by a providence that seems to favor the Americans across ages, allowed the new republic to pursue its own ends and to have a fully independent strategy for the first time. The geographic imperatives of that strategy were already in evidence in the century and a half preceding independence. People forget we have a lot of history prior to 1776. For the constellation of English settlements strung out along the Atlantic seaboard, a clutch of maxims applied. They included these principles. First, that the territory from the sea to the fall line, denoting the end of riverine navigability, must be fully controlled. Second, that the territory from the fall line to the Appalachian hinterland must be, if not controlled, then secured, lest it become a zone of disorder from which destabilizing action can emerge. Third, that the major navigable rivers offering access to the interior, chief among them the Hudson and the Ohio, be fully controlled. Fourth, that the twin bastions of the Mississippi and the St. Lawrence, the latter granting access to the massive inland seas of the Great Lakes, were the keys to the domination of North America. Fifth, that the maritime exposure of the American seaboard was so substantive and so integrated into the trading networks of the European world that the maritime domain was of equal and existential importance to the vast West. The early republic was therefore, because of these imperatives, within a generation of American victory in the Revolution, making war at various points against Britain, again, Spain, France, and the Indian nations of the Old Northwest. We'll toss in North Africa for good measure. It was simply the case that the United States, as recognized in 1783, was confined within borders that were by their nature unstable and impermanent. America therefore rounded out its initial land frontiers with a de facto war against Spain for the acquisition of the Floridas, and a barely averted war with Spain and then France for the possession of the Mississippi Basin. Now, the United States did attempt to conquer the other major basin. I'm glad the Canadians have mostly left, so they don't have to hear me say this. The St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, but proved unable to do so due to a combination of American military incapacity, British military power, and nascent Canadian patriotism. We can thank Laura Secord for having thwarted the American ambitions to control of the Great North. Nevertheless, this is important to note, within 2 years of the validation of American defeat in the North in the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, the Anglo-American treaties of 1817 and 1818 had the effect of actually securing American strategic aims, as the frontier between the United States and British North America was effectively demilitarized, and American commercial access to the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes was effectively secured. The war in which the United States failed to conquer Canada was also, however, the war in which the United States established itself as a credible power at sea, able to defend its shipping and also able to contend with the best European navies. Having fought both the French and British navies to a draw between 1798 and 1815, the Americans secured control of our maritime frontier in the same era in which we grasp our landward approaches. Come the first half of the 19th century, then, the United States arrived at both the culmination of its original strategic challenges and also an assumption of new ones. We cast our eyes upon the middle of that century, we see 4 new imperatives enter into American strategic thought. First, the westward expansion to the Pacific had to be managed. Second, the establishment of a southward maritime frontier, primarily in the Caribbean. Third, the collision of the Anglo-American cultural sphere with the vast Spanish imperial inheritance. And fourth, the growing imperative of exclusion of extra hemispheric powers from the Americas. These new imperatives were by no means mutually exclusive. The Pacific expansion, the Caribbean expansion, and the collision with the Mundo Hispanico were each concurrent with one another. The great question of the 19th century, as far as America's land borders went, was of seeking stable and permanent frontiers in the South and West. The Texas Revolution of 1835 to 1836, which, despite what they'll tell you at Castillo Chapultepec, was an unplanned and local affair on part of the United States, had the effect of introducing dynamism into a status quo ante of uncertain instability on par with the Spanish cession of Louisiana a generation earlier. The combination of aggressive American exploitation and insufficient Mexican statecraft did the rest. Now, I want to say, as somebody who works in Mexico policy, that the American war in Mexico in that era, from 1846 through 1848, contrary to popular assumption, especially in Mexico, was winnable by the Mexicans. Mexican arms eventually, to their great credit, halted the northern armies of the United States under Zachary Taylor at Buena Vista, to the point that he could not continue that campaign. And they were grasping toward the Fabian approach in the south that would eventually take Benito Juarez to victory against the French 20 years later. But as a young American officer named Ulysses Grant noted in his memoirs, the valor of the Mexican soldier was not equal to the qualities of Mexican leadership. Nevertheless, America had definitively secured itself on the Pacific in 1818 with a treaty that secured the Anglo-American condominium of Oregon, but it was not a true Pacific power until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo put America into California in 1848. Now, I want to note the highly contingent nature of American possession on the Pacific. Look at any population map of the United States today in the year 2026, and what you'll note is a massive settlement east of the 100th meridian, but you'll also see a hyper-productive population island in California off to the west. If there's any part of the United States that could be truly autarkic, that's it. We also ought to note the highly contingent nature of the southern frontier achieved in 1848 with a minor expansion in 1853. The Rio Grande is a natural border of sorts, but culturally and demographically, it actually is the heart of a particular peopling, originally of Nuevo Mexico and my ancestors, Nuevo Santander, rather than a border as such. This quality in itself lends an instability to its purpose that persists to this day. Yet that river forms only half of the modern US-Mexico border. The other half is mere lines on a map, conforming to surveyed points rather than natural features as such, and still less to patterns of settlement. There's one thing we know about borders imposed by fiat rather than geography or demography: forces will inexorably press upon them. Expand the historical aperture beyond the 1860s to the First World War, and America's maritime frontiers in that southerly sphere enter into a state of contestation that remains unresolved to this day. Prior to the American Civil War, movements for the acquisition of Cuba and the establishment of an American commodities and plantation imperium in the Caribbean basin, the so-called Golden Circle gathered force. Occasionally, they resulted in filibustering expeditions that often enough ended in the American protagonists coming home penniless if lucky and facing a local firing squad, if not. Here, too, the American search for strategic frontiers culminated in war, this time against the remnants of Spain's half-millennium imperium. The acquisitions of Cuba, shortly to be granted a conditional independence, and Puerto Rico, to be followed by the purchase of the Danish West Indies in 1917, made the United States at last a genuinely Caribbean power. A Caribbean regional role as guarantor and enforcer followed. In a very real sense, the whole roster of American interventions and crises across the Caribbean basin, from Cuba in 1962 to the occupations of Nicaragua and Haiti, to the 1965 occupation of the Dominican Republic, to the 1983 invasion of Grenada and the Contra War and beyond, have their roots in the strategic expansion of 1898. Again, that expansion was a consequence of the instability of the old frontiers. Now, I want to note 2 special cases at this point, relevant to the topic of America's strategy in the Americas. First is obvious: the Panama Canal and the attendant canal zone, for decades sovereign American territory, which persisted from the Hay-Bunalvarilla Treaty of 1903 to the Carter-Torrijos Treaties of 1977. The Panama Canal is a sort of apotheosis of American power and interest in the hemisphere, and that reputation is justified, but it must be understood within a broader context of U.S. investment in a genuinely hemispheric superstructure. Unlike Europe, with the centuries and even millennia of roads and transportation infrastructure, much of it dating to Roman times, the Americas required the creation of these passages ex nihilo. Only two nations tried to do it, France to no eventual effect, and the United States, which finished the passage between the seas. Yet the canal does not stand alone. The United States also secured the sea routes around Tierra del Fuego. The United States also linked the North American continent by rail. The United States also made passable the portage between the Mississippi and the Great Lakes, the most stupendous internal waterway in the world. The United States also, with our Canadian friends and partners, created the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes Waterway, elevating the utility of that basin to that of its Mississippian counterpart. The United States also constructed the great works to make possible the massive cities and ports of our Pacific West. One could go on. The point is that the Panama Canal is an apotheosis, but it is not alone. These works, too, are reflective of this American strategic interest in the Americas. The second special case is one I noted earlier, the collision of the Anglo-American cultural sphere with the vast Spanish imperial inheritance. I'm not ignoring the fact of the enormous Portuguese imperial inheritance in our Brazilian friends, but the historical fact is that we have no comparable collision with them. As a descendant myself of both Mayflower passengers and conquistadors who fought alongside the great Cortez, and as a native of South Texas, a culturally Mexican region of the United States, and itself an Anglo-Republic, I will claim personal privilege on this point. The topic is one that is both fraught and extensive, and it would trespass upon the boundaries of the time and theme we have here to explore it in full. But suffice it to say that the observations made by Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1835 first volume of his Democracy in America ring true today. This is what he writes. The Constitution of the United States is like those exquisite productions of human industry which ensure wealth and renown for their inventors, but which are profitless in any other hands. This truth is exemplified by the condition of Mexico. The Mexicans were desirous of establishing a federal system, and they took the federal constitution of their neighbors, the Anglo-Americans, as their model, and copied it with considerable accuracy. But although they borrowed the letter of the law, they were unable to create or introduce the spirit and sense which gave it life. And to the present day, Mexico is alternately the victim of anarchy and the slave of military despotism. Now, I want to be very clear what de Tocqueville is and is not saying here, because his meaning is mine. He is not arguing for an intrinsic inferiority of the Mexicans, far from it, nor of the Latin Americans, the republics of the former Spanish Empire, to which the same analysis applies. Simón Bolívar, despairing of his own achievement at his life's ends, came to a comparable conclusion. America is ungovernable for us, he wrote. And the root of that perennial dysfunction is the grafting on of a model of Anglo-American republicanism onto societies with a fundamentally Spanish cultural and political inheritance. Spain and her daughter nations in the Americas are by no means unsuited for liberty or humane liberality. It's quite the opposite, as anyone familiar with either La Escuela de Salamanca or Spain's own miraculous democratic transition will attest. Latin American friends like to remind us that there were universities flourishing in Mexico and Peru when the English pilgrims were starving to death on the shores of Plymouth, and they're right. Yet what we see across the centuries throughout the politics of Latin America is precisely what de Tocqueville observed. This alien civics and a civilization which possesses its own organic forms of government society and perhaps ought look more to them. The outcomes are too often uncertain at best and sanguinary at worst. The Mexican eminence and former Foreign Minister Jorge Castañeda, in his 2011 Mañana Forever, writes on the fundamental differentiations between Mexican and American civil society. Again, it is not that one is superior and one is inferior. That's not my meaning. It is my own view that the United States is clearly superior in the rule of law and ordered liberty, and that Mexico and Latin America is superior in faith and family. Lest my fellow Americans derive too much satisfaction from that, do not forget that the latter shows forth where people actually live. Pope Leo XIV, a native-born American, so American that he roots for the White Sox, which only an American would be foolish enough to do, served for decades in Peru, and he appears to agree. Now, Latin America writ large therefore generates a perennial and enduring phenomenon that powerfully directs American strategic thought and commands American strategic attention: instability. I listed before the myriad American interventions of the Caribbean Basin. Add to them a myriad of the same in Mexico for generations after 1848, and even on occasion in South America, on which I'll have more to say shortly. This is the driver of that collision between the Anglo-American cultural sphere with the vast Spanish imperial inheritance. It is not a Huntingtonian happening. It is not a clashing civilizations unable to coexist by their nature. It is rather a recurrent happening of the de facto ungoverned spaces, the exportation of disorder, whether it's Pancho Villa raiding Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, or the Havana regime supporting terrorism around the world across decades, or the present-day Mexican regime sending material aid to dictatorships and tolerating cartel takeovers of swaths of its own sovereign territory. This recurrent phenomenon drove the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, essentially declaring that if local government would not control its territory, America would, and that drives a great deal of policy now. President Trump reaffirmed it yesterday. Ecclesiastes would look upon it and say there is no new thing. These ungoverned spaces raise the specter of some other power entering and governing them, and the threat here is not hypothetical. The fracas of Mexican governance alone in the first half-century after independence, coupled to a weak and endlessly fragmenting Mexican state, brought an array of predatory powers onto Mexican territory. The Americans were one. The Spanish, contemplating reconquest, were another, and most famously the French were another, and they were beaten only after the United States raised the cost of French intervention too high for Napoleon III. This was not the end of outside powers' intervention in Mexico. The German Empire of the First World War sought to exploit Mexico's carrancistas against the United States, most famously with the 1917 Zimmermann telegram. When the United States Army fought the carrancistas at the 1918 Battle of Ambos Nogales, German advisors, according to U.S. Army reports, were found dead in the Mexican positions, making it the only land battle of World War I fought in the Western Hemisphere. Today, one of the Russian Federation's largest diplomatic presences in the world is in Mexico, and they're there for neither the food nor the weather. Mexican regimes that are anti-American in orientation are happy to leverage this third power engagement. Most recently, in 2023, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador invited Russian and Chinese troops to parade through the Zócalo on Mexican Independence Day. It was a message to us. The imperative of exclusion, therefore, of extra-hemispheric powers from the Americas, you and I know it better as the Monroe Doctrine, remains as vital for the United States today as it was at its issuance just over 2 centuries ago. The Georgian historian Alexander Mikaberidze, in his 2020 book on the global Napoleonic Wars, wrote that the independence of the Latin American republics had the paradoxical effect of removing them from global history, by which he means that the integral parts of a globe-spanning empire now mostly cease to interact with the wider world. Mexico City once governed the Philippines and controlled the China trade. Come the wars for independence, all that was gone. This is not to lament that outcome, but to provide a frame for understanding the American strategic imperative here, which is not just to compel the governance of the ungoverned spaces, but to keep history well away from the Americas. Thus, we see, come 1914, that the United States had arrived at a sort of culmination in its interests and therefore its strategy in the Americas. Only in the North did America's strategic frontier resolve itself with no attendant warfare. The concord with Canada meant that that dominion was a trusted power in securing the Arctic, later to be joined by Denmark's generous grant of American defense privileges in Greenland, and the acquisition of Alaska, itself driven by Russian strategic insecurity, all of which gave the United States its own territorial foothold in that sphere. The remainder of the 20th century of America and the Americas proceeded along the fundamentals thus laid down. The need to maintain American hard power primacy, the imperative to deter and combat extra-hemispheric powers, the necessity of contending with the ungoverned spaces, the maintenance of strategic frontiers, and the defense of the hemispheric superstructure. By the time American forces descended upon Panama for the overthrow of that narco regime on December 20th, 1989, enabling the return of a democracy that flourishes to this day, it could be fairly said that the United States had achieved all its strategic goals in the Americas. Come the end of the Cold War, there was no meaningful hostile regime in the hemisphere outside that in Havana. There was no extra-hemispheric actor threatening American lives and commerce. There were no significant ungoverned spaces exporting threats to America, and the only major one that did in Colombia was shortly to be extinguished by a combination of Colombian political bravery and American aid. There was a constellation of American bases and facilities around the entire Caribbean basin securing our strategic frontier to the south. There was a reliable and military-strong ally to the north in Canada, securing America's strategic frontier to the north. And finally, there was a steadily improving ally to the south in Mexico, rapidly reforming to integrate itself into both the American trade and security infrastructure. All this was true on December 20th, 1989. On January 20th, 2025, none of it was true. On the day that President Donald Trump returned to office, every single one of those factors was absent. 36 years ago, there were no meaningfully hostile regimes in the Americas beyond Havana. On January 20th, 2025, there were multiple, from Havana to Caracas to La Paz to Managua to Mexico City. 36 years ago, there were no meaningful extra-hemispheric actors in the Americas. On January 20th, 2025, the Iranians and Hezbollah were long established, and the Russians and Chinese were present nearly everywhere. 36 years ago, there were no significant ungoverned spaces exporting threat to America. On January 20th, 2025, in Mexico alone, between 1/3 and half of the national territory was surrendered to narco-terrorists whose trades killed Mexicans and Americans by the hundreds of thousands. 36 years ago, there was a constellation of American bases in the Caribbean basin. On January 20th, 2025, there was a mere handful. The entire American position had been almost completely surrendered, and the Panama Canal was left effectively unsecured. 36 years ago, America's northern strategic frontier was secured by a strong Canada. On January 20th, 2025, Canadian military power is insufficient to secure its own Arctic. And the Canadian Prime Minister has since announced his intention to turn away from America, including an astonishing strategic partnership, as he terms it, with the People's Republic of China. 36 years ago, Mexico was improving in democracy and security and rule of law. On January 20th, 2025, it was rapidly failing on all three counts, and events since have made things even worse. Consider then everything we have seen in American action in the Americas and American strategy in the Americas since January 20th, 2025 as an effort to recoup the position and the defense in which we, in our arrogance and apathy after the Cold War, let slip away. This is not the fault of any other power within the Americas or even outside of it. It was our own. We believed that history was over, or at least that the Micaberitze thesis, that Latin America would stay well outside of history's reach, would hold without reinforcement. Neither was ever true. Thus, we see what has happened since, old imperatives, with new urgency. We see the Secretary of War committing the United States to a strategic concept of a greater North America, a strategic frontier that is almost entirely coterminous with the old idea of the Golden Circle and the reestablishment of the Caribbean Basin's southern strategic frontier. We see a renewed and aggressive American interest in the Arctic, including but not limited to a prospective acquisition of Greenland, reestablishing the American strategic frontier to the north in the absence of a credible Canadian ability to do the same. We see American intolerance for the Mexican regime's double game, delivering operational cooperation to the United States while protecting its own robust class of narco-politicians, reestablishing the American expectation that its southern border be secured by any means. We see American willingness to enter the ungoverned spaces and bring war and accountability to their denizens, whether in a spectacular raid in Caracas, or in strikes on drug facilities in Ecuador, or in attacks on alleged narco vessels on the high seas. We see American reestablishment of the constellation of bases and facilities across the Caribbean basin, including the direct provision of Panama Canal security, reviving American hard power and dominance and guarantees in that region. We see American action against extra hemispheric powers, from Iranian terror networks in Venezuela and beyond to Chinese commercial and intelligence penetration in places like Peru and Panama, reinforcing and revivifying the Monroe Doctrine in a new century. We see American action against entire hostile regimes, directly in Venezuela, implicitly in Mexico, and soon, we hope, in Cuba, restoring the principle that America will act in the spirit of the Roosevelt Corollary and see to the defense of its own proximate frontiers. We see all this, and with an understanding of the history behind it, we understand that it was all inevitable and predictable with reference to the history at hand. What is happening now is therefore not a revolution, but a restoration. The United States is not charting new territory in its strategy. It is returning to what is tried and true. The one major exception to the whole, one singular discontinuity, is in the America's Counter-Cartel Coalition that was announced in Inaugural last March. We should be candid and acknowledge that the AFPI, taken to its logical ends, in facilitating sustained U.S. military engagement on the continent of South America in particular, represents a meaningful strategic commitment where no U.S. interest has previously compelled one in 2.5 centuries. This is a significant departure. From July 4, 1776 to January 3, 2026, it was not the policy of the United States to fight in South America. Now it is, and it is a change whose limiting principles remain undefined. Yet even this exception illuminates the rule. American strategy in the Western Hemisphere was foreordained. Geography, sentiment, threat, and circumstance all combined to make it what it is. And that combination was in effect long ago. Expand the aperture, and what we have now was inevitable the moment the Jamestown and Plymouth settlements achieved self-sufficiency. Narrow it to our time alone, and it was inevitable that eventually we would have an administration alert to the dangers to America and the Americas, and willing to do something about it. What comes next will be guided by that leadership and those enduring imperatives. America's actions to come in the Americas therefore ought to be no surprise once we grasp America's interest in the Americas in full. In this White House, at last, I have confidence that we will. Thank you.